Infrastructure businesses tend to trend as like being horizontal versus verticalized businesses. And if you think about like the transition phases of a company, like you start like everyone starts somewhat horizontal and or a lot of companies start somewhat horizontal, but in order to scale, in order to differentiate and to build kind of bespoke experiences over time and cross the chasm, you have to verticalize the business.
Welcome. This is Second Acts, a podcast where we document how SaaS leaders chart the challenging, chaotic, ultimately foundational second acts of scaling up organizations. And I'm your host, Krish Subramanian, co-founder and CEO at ChargeBee. For this episode, I had the chance to speak with Lithic's co-founder and CEO, Jiang. Lithic in itself was born as a second act. In 2014, Bo co-founded privacy.com, a B2C virtual cards platform that they built into a cash-efficient business that serves hundreds of thousands of users and has processed more than $2 billion. In the process of scaling privacy.com, the team ended up building a lot of the core infrastructure around card issuing, processing, and compliance. They soon noticed how outside developers were attempting to reverse engineer their internal APIs, which led them to open up those issuing APIs through a beta program that saw immediate adoption. Soon after, in 2020, they publicly launched that as a separate B2B offering. This grew as instantaneously that they decided to go all in, rebrand as Lithic, and raise $110 million within a span of a couple of years. In our conversation, we talked about how privacy.com became their first and foundational customer, the thinking behind taking a very different hypergrowth path with Lithic, why most infrastructure companies make the horizontal to vertical shift, the traps of chasing an unlimited TAM, and a whole lot more. Dive right in. And if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And if you really like the conversation, drop us a review. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'm very excited about talking about some of your learnings here, Bo.
Yeah, very excited to be here. Very excited to share some of our learnings and hopefully help folks short circuit or make some quicker decisions than we did in the early days.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get started. I'll start with some to warm up. I'll start with some questions to get the conversation started.
Yeah.
So you have previously noted that you essentially bootstrapped the company or raised very little capital for the first 6 years of the journey, and then raised $100 million within a span of a couple of years. Right? It's fascinating, but it's also true to like the Chinese bamboo story for a lot of us, where we keep at the problem for like several years, growing roots, and then it shoots up like overnight. A lot of things start happening. And can you tell us a little bit about the raising of the funds to enter this hyperscale phase? What did it look like? And what made you particularly shift gears from a self-funded existence to this particular phase of raising capital? And in hindsight, would you approach this differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think first of all, like on the bootstrap side, we raised very little. I think to credit, it wasn't sort of a true bootstrap model, but I think of really like our business as like kind of having been through two phases in the past 10 years, right? And yeah, the first phase was a very capital efficient, lean team. We were never more than 20 people, always like burning very little, close to cash flow break even. Um, and I think that was the right funding model for the business that we were starting. You know, a lot of times like people are like, don't ever raise any venture capital. Or like, if you're doing something big, raise a bunch, right? And I think like we kind of threaded the needle the right way where it was a like high retention, relatively efficient consumer business that was differentiated and somewhat niche. And so we started with a virtual card for consumers, and that business has isn't one that I think needs a ton of capital. Now, in the process of building that business, we wound up realizing that, hey, like the infrastructure powering cards and money movement is broken, and we wound up having to build our own over many years. And that that's there's a way you can kind of bootstrap to that. But when we looked at like, hey, what do we want to accomplish when we start selling to other companies and building that infrastructure and productizing it, we realized that we really needed to raise a lot of capital to kind of build the type of infrastructure that we wanted to make those investments, right? A
Mm.
couple of like, easy examples is like, when you're managing reliability for your own systems, like that's you have one bar in some ways. You have a little bit more room for error, I'd say. If you're doing that for others at scale, like you just have to have like a lot more controls in place. Um,
Right.
and so I think we realized that quite early on. Um, and we're fortunate to have investors that kind of believed in sort of the opportunity set um, and so kind of went for it. Um, there are a lot of things that I would do differently as a company, but I think the approach to raising capital, where we raised a healthy amount of capital, but not at a totally disconnected valuation. And I think that has actually been kind of an advantage in the current environment, sort of having that balance sheet, being able to make long-term investments, still being a private company is sort of I think a pretty big advantage right now for us at our stage.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And um, there are a lot more questions related to the capital, but let
Yeah.
me come back to this. Right.
Yeah.
The other side that I also find fascinating in your journey is you still operate privacy.com, right? The first business that you started,
Yeah.
and Lithic also together, right? B2C and B2B in many ways. Um, I would love to understand the dynamic here. That is, you have described privacy.com as Lithic's first customer, very similar to exactly what you just said, which is if you build a reliability for yourself versus others. It's very similar to Amazon Commerce and AWS, like how AWS came off what they actually built for Amazon. In what ways did the first customer prove foundational when you are beginning to scale Lithic as a North Star customer? Like because it can also become a trap when you think of yourself as a first customer.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of the reason why we started Lithic was due to the pain that we experienced scaling our own infrastructure with privacy.com. And I'd say in many ways, like we were lucky that privacy is kind of, I think, symbolic or a good sort of example customer of a lot of net new use cases that are being built today. Um, so that's the first thought. The second thought is a lot of a lot of folks that raise venture capital, a lot of like kind of conventional wisdom out there says like, hey, like you have to stay super focused. Like if you're going to do something like this, like kill the original business, and kind of just go all in on the infrastructure play or whatever it is, right? Like that was some of the advice we've gotten, and I think that's generally true, but like specifically not true for us. Um, and today we do run it basically as a customer of Lithic from an org perspective. I'd say it's the reasons it's not been true for us is like, like I think one of the key values for us as a company is customer centricity, and like having a customer super close like that is very helpful for kind of keeping that empathy and keeping that like intuition around customer needs close. Um, a second one is like specific to our business and building payments infrastructure. Um, in addition to the technology, there's a lot of like operational compliance risk, a lot of sort of framework that you have to have internally, and having sort of the customer very close and having that like pulse on like that expertise is like very, very important, very, very important, and has been really useful for scaling our business. Um, and then I'd say the third sort of underrated thing is like it does enable us to to test things out a little bit more quickly than say like you otherwise would. Sort of think about infrastructure. Like you don't really have like quite the same level of like stage releases and A/B testing that you can do with a consumer product. And so having privacy there kind of enables us to do some of that in a way that I think helps us execute more quickly. And so like I think maybe one of the takeaways here is like there's a lot of conventional wisdom in startup land, and it is generally true, but can be specifically wrong for you. And it's really important to kind of like unpack the why behind like, what you're doing.
Mm. And would you actually say when it comes to the customers, does it still remain your ICP? Less privacy, actually, like by many definitions of, let's say, number of employees or like other metrics that you would actually use to think about a typical ideal customer or a stretch customer that you would want today? Is this still the same or has it shifted over time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think ICP with infrastructure businesses is actually like one like infrastructure businesses tend to trend as like being horizontal versus verticalized businesses. And if you think about like the transition phases of the company, like you start like everyone starts somewhat horizontal and or a lot of companies start somewhat horizontal, but in order to scale, in order to differentiate and to build kind of bespoke experiences over time and cross the chasm, you have to verticalize the business, right? Um, and so
Beautiful point.
I think, sorry,
That's a beautiful point and more nuance there. Right. We'll come
yeah,
back to unpack that. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt your straight train of
yeah,
thoughts. Please keep going.
no,
Yeah.
no, totally. I think um,
So we tend to verticalize it.
we try to verticalize it, and I think for us, like we are still so early in sort of this like journey of redefining like the financial services industry that the privacy ICP doesn't fit exactly, but it's sort of this notion of like tech forward, innovative company that wants to build something like novel and new. Like that does still generally map, even if like our ICP has like evolved and probably grown to like larger companies in the past couple of years, or really kind of mid market multi-hundred person companies generally over the past couple of years. So
Fantastic. And what I want to go back to this previous point that you made, which is infrastructure companies tend to start as horizontal companies, and then you layer the verticals to make it more bespoke, more purpose built for various verticals. Why do you
yeah.
think that is? And are there particular examples that come to mind that you would want to uh, explain a little bit more about?
Yeah. I think you look at kind of the evolution of like cloud storage is a good example, right? Where cloud storage kind of started out just like kind of general purpose, and then you started to see like specific use cases crop out, and then those specific use cases then kind of really ladder up to verticals, right? I think you look across like Twilio is another good example, right? Where like how they've scaled over time is like verticalizing the business. um you look at like on in sort of financial services and infrastructure closer to home. There's even on acquiring, right? Acquiring, like there's the use cases and how you differentiate for a simple platform that's just selling, let's say like you know, uh, stuff that you made yourself. Like Shopify is a good example, right? A lot of
Mm.
Shopify, like the long tail use cases versus like the use cases for like a marketplace, with Stripe Connect are quite different, right? And so I think a lot of folks start out with a horizontal offering and cater to um, innovators that like want to build something totally new and are willing to, and actually in fact want to do a lot of the heavy lifting and control that experience. But those tend to be like by definition, the innovators tend to be a small percentage of the market. And so as you start to grow the business, you need to kind of move beyond the innovators to the early majority and so on. Um, and that requires kind of more complete solutions and more thoughtful verticals. There's this famous saying about like, people buy products that most people buy products that they think others like them buy, right? And I think that is also how you build like differentiation and like abstracting away the complexity and that's where a lot of the margin is in many ways, right? Where you're willing to solve problems that others don't want to solve.
Yes. Yeah. That's a beautiful point, right? I think there is a lot to think, unpack, because many a times one of the traps, at least this is my view, is we don't recognize that trying to be like being horizontal and having an unlimited TAM is interesting, but at the same time, to be able to bring this to customers, it is very important that you are very close to the customer's world, vertical by vertical, or in some shape or form, and then commit to that to solve the problems as closely as possible is also one of the best ways to scale the business. As you mentioned, cross the chasm, right? To be able to
Yeah.
do that, getting closer to the customer's problem and being able to solve that is very, very important. So I think this mental model of, yes, eventually I'm actually architecting it in a way it can be horizontal, but there are parts of the product that you have to get closer to that vertical to be able to solve it well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think to your point on sometimes like having an unlimited TAM is actually like I think the reason why it's bad is like or why it's something to be kind of cognizant of is that it also means that you're selling a somewhat commodity product. Like you think about the things that really have big TAM, right? It's like these are like commodity services, right? Um, and are not very capital efficient, and especially in the current environment, if you're balancing like kind of capital efficiency as a thing, which I think most venture backed companies are now rediscovering, like that's a you can be a lot more capital efficient if you're more vertically
Right.
inclined.
Plus, price elasticity becomes a lot more easier if you are
Yeah,
solving the problem closer to the customer as well. Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
yeah, beautiful. Um, so shifting a little bit, which is to non-obvious customers and use cases. There is example is insurance dispersal, OTAs such as Priceline in your world, right?
Yeah.
Um, what have been some of the wins, mistakes around building at scale product for a diverse customer base across consumer and commercial use cases? And what is the kind of role that a partner ecosystem can play here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this dovetails really well. It dovetails very well with kind of the verticalization question because you have a horizontal product and that means that and if for us like it's horizontal and we're trying to lower the barrier to entry for building novel things. um and so sometimes you'll see like one or two customers come in through like a vertical use case. Travel is a really good example, OTAs, where you may get some like kind of innovators that are like, hey, I want to roll a lot of my own stuff and my own infrastructure. And so I'm going to work with a player like Lithic. The problem is like, one of the challenges there is like those one or two early adopters in that vertical aren't really fully representative of aren't necessarily fully representative of the entire vertical. And so you have to be really careful about saying like, oh, like we have like some pull here, but like how deep is the pool of demand in that particular vertical for your solution? How much additional work, R&D, marketing, overhead and support, compliance, like for us, like how much additional work is required to unlock a deeper pool? Because you look at like again, online travel is a really good example because that's a very deep pool from a TPV perspective, total payment volume perspective. But in order
Yeah,
to build a complete solution, that's a multi-year for sure, if not like decade investment to kind of build a truly complete solution. And so that's one where that's an industry where we're like, hey, like we'd much rather partner with folks that have built a much more complete solution, rather than kind of compete head to head.
Mm. And does some of the learning come from scars, or is it from how do you think about it? Because it's through the journey to actually unlock growth, right? I'm looking at it from a founder
Yeah,
perspective, right? And then you think about it. The amount of
yeah,
TPV that you can actually unlock through that one or two customers is so outsized compared to the number of customers that you have to find to compensate for similar TPV, which
yeah,
means the pull is much stronger to be able to make a clear no decision. Does some of
yeah,
this come from scars, or are there thought experiments that you went through to say, okay, now do we
yeah.
go through it? How did that decision come about?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things to balance as a founder is like you have to be first principles, and very like kind of evidence driven. But at the same time, there are certain things that if you take the right advice and apply it to yourself, like you can short circuit a lot of pain. And so like I think we've skewed a lot more probably towards like those those learnings firsthand, and I think that's probably something that I would have done a little differently in terms of like moving more quickly on sort of realizing, hey, like this isn't a deep pool actually, because like if you do some research, like there's actually like not a lot of players out there that are kind of you know representative of this vertical and want to do this much kind of customization. um,
It's a very important and beautiful point there, because one of the trap that I am seeing is we all get into this is when it comes to establishing product market fit, we tend to commit to talking to a lot more people, being more careful about the assessment and do a lot of things. But at scale, when we think we have a customer base and then we have revenue and all of that, and when we are layering new things, it is important to recognize that you are again establishing new PMF, which is in a different segment
yeah,
or in a different vertical and a different motion altogether. So it's very important to recognize a 0 to 1 wherever it's happening versus a suddenly scaling that happens in the rest of the segment. Success in one of that doesn't lend itself naturally to success in another one, especially if we don't think through it, recognize that one, it's a 0 to 1 motion all over again in a different segment. We can fall into a trap, right? By
yeah,
not doing some of the foundational things that we probably did well to establish product market fit.
definitely, definitely. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of times, you kind of have to take this beginner mindset approach to new verticals and like new expansion. Um, you know, and that is, that's hard if you're at scale and you're like, hey, like, we're doing billions and billions in volume. Like we know what we're doing, right? And it's like, yeah, you may know what you're doing in a certain vertical, doing a certain job to be done. Um, but you have to just really kind of be willing to kind of uh, take a beginner's mindset to that expansion.
Fantastic. Um, Another question, which is you have emphasized the how your mission is to make the complexity of making issuing simple and accessible to developers and businesses. Um, they are not the same thing often. And so, what sort of go-to-market motion have you arrived at to offer an API platform that developers love? And then, but businesses adopt at scale and for its value, especially given the size of the companies, right? And what have been some of the implications of how you have scaled monetization between these two different motions?
Yeah. It's a lot of questions. It's a good question. A lot of one. I think, I think in terms of like kind of, like simple and accessible to both developers and businesses, like I think a lot of that is about making the right abstractions and the right trade-offs, and picking the right ideal customers, and really thinking about like, hey, like at the base level, what developers want and what the business wants, actually isn't all that different. Developers want clean APIs, that's not orthogonal to clean intuitive APIs. That's not orthogonal to what the businesses want, or business stakeholders will want, perhaps. In our business, like everyone wants the numbers to be kind of to tie out very well and to have like kind of real time reconciliation and an events-based system and like the observability of a modern platform. And so it's really kind of about like, I think about it as like having a strong system of record and exposing that system of record in a consistent way, such that like, what comes through the API, may it be via webhooks or like whatever it may be, and also what gets reported out via like a dashboard or like, billing or, whatever reporting format is consistent. And I think that is a advantage that modern systems have, where you have that single source. If you've in many in financial services have grown through a lot of inorganic means. I think the downside of that, if you don't do the integrations well and you just kind of glue the systems together, is like you have multiple systems of record, and that's a very hard problem where you have to struggle with reconciling your own systems, and then you have to make sure that your customer systems are consistent.
Right. And do you like we go through this many a times, especially with at scale customers, which is the biggest barrier in adoption, and also the the value assigned to the heavy lifting is mostly related to the implementation.
Yeah.
Right? And a clean implementation that makes systems talk to each other and make it work.
Yeah, totally. I think on that note, like I think the pendulum is swinging the other way now, but there was at least a couple of years where like professional services and like like one-off like implementation revenue was like considered like kind of dirty or like not like SaaS, right? And it's true, it's not SaaS, right? But if you're doing that in service of successful customer outcomes, I think it's absolutely something to kind of lean into, where it's like, look, like we're only successful if our customers are successful. And if we need to have a non-recurring component of our economic model to kind of make that work, like we should absolutely be doing it, regardless of how the market values that revenue. Like, it isn't as quote unquote valuable to our business, but you know, our business is only valuable if our customers are successful.
True. And we see this in the software sales, right? I don't know if is your model more transactional revenue model?
We have a couple of components, but yeah, we have the upfront component to help with implementations and launching customers. We have a platform fee to kind of support our kind of overhead costs, and then we have a variable usage-based component
Very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, very similar, right? And then we see this often where we serve freemium customers all the in the early stage to the enterprises. And this is a common pattern, and it's a new learning as well for us to not reject the idea, but actually embrace it to say, now, what makes a customer successful does. Uh, and also incentivizing even the sales process to say, leave enough room for professional services to be monetized because the customer has a particular budget the first year. But being comfortable with leaving room for that and saying, and then monetizing professional services and making sure the implementation is actually successful while you discount the first year platform fees, and then being able to get into a step up into a second year and third year revenue for long-term success of the customer. I think anyways, nobody's going to have overages in the first year
Yeah.
of that implementation. So how do you actually like think about structuring it? For us, there's a ton of learning with respect to even incentivizing the sales team, the sales leadership, and the attainment goals, right? Because it's very tempting to actually be able to capture all of it, let's say in ARR or platform fees, if that is
Yeah.
actually available, because it helps with the attainment of the goals.
Right.
But getting
Right.
comfortable, it's part of the change management that we have been going through as well to make sure it's the deals are structured correctly when it comes to onboarding customers to create that mutual win-win.
Yeah. I'd say
What do you
it's one of
think?
these things. It's always a work in progress, and incentives drive a lot. But if you layer the right incentives with the right value of being customer obsessed, it usually kind of works itself out.
Mm, Beautiful. Um, and last question. So the 4-year roller coaster that we all went through, and the highs of, so we went through the highs of unexpected growth spurt, and then resetting during this, um, and then resetting to a pre-pandemic level to some degree, right? And when it comes to hiring, what's your framework in evaluating and enabling senior leadership, especially when you have brought in some really good senior leaders? What has been the framework when it comes to evaluation and also enablement
Yeah,
of these leaders?
yeah. I'd say it's definitely evolved a little bit, and uh, on specifics, we have different obviously subject matter and like evaluations for different specific functions. A general thing that we look for is the ability to kind of altitude shift, or that's from a general aptitude perspective of like, hey, you should obviously be able to talk high level strategy for your function and for the whole company. You should be a good representative of the company for external folks. um, but you should also be able to dive in deep, fairly deep, and understand the nuances, because a lot of the insights and these kind of high level decisions are driven by an understanding of like kind of the specifics of the business and the function. So that's one thing we look for just across the board, from like past experience and kind of desire in some ways, right? I think a common mistake a lot of folks, including ourselves, made was like, oh, like, we're going from X revenue to Y revenue this year and X headcount to Y headcount this year. That's the plan. We need someone who's like done that before. And like, they've like got the playbook and they're just gonna apply it, right? And like that's the kind of, I think, um, floppy thinking that is now like under a lot of pressure in this current environment. I think that's generally for the better for the ecosystem. I'd say another thing that we've always prized is adaptability. And what I mean by that is like, it's always a really positive sign if someone is able to be both successful in like a like early stage environment and in a growth stage in a public company environment. Like I think that kind of adaptability is really valuable. It gives you kind of context. It builds empathy for like, our what our customers are going through, what our teams are going through. And so that's one of those things where it's not a core value per se, because it's a little trite to I think to call adaptability a core value, but we definitely look for that in folks that we're talking to of like, hey, like, can you operate in multiple different environments, changing quickly.
Beautiful. There was a word that I remember reading describing people as fungible people. Some some people who
Yeah,
are, who are very
yeah,
comfortable as an individual contributor, working with small groups of people to bring outcomes, to move things from
yeah,
0 to 1, or to be able to lead with by example, even a large group of people and having a good followership to solve complex
yeah,
problems. And people who are capable of breaking down, looking at systemic issues, and then saying, okay, breaking it down, putting process in place to solve it so that it scales. It's yeah, it's rare. I think I see what you're saying, right? Deliberately
yeah.
testing people's ability to what you mentioned as altitude,
Altitude
uh,
shifting, dive
altitude
if you can
shifting.
dive deep, right? Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
beautiful. Fantastic. Fantastic.
yeah.
Um, this is great. Right. It was great in talking to you, Bo. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for making time to share your learnings with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you.